Hello, this is Patrick with the Fundamental Principle. I'm here with a important guest, the guest that I greatly admire. So I have on the Gumroad. We're going to be releasing a book, Time to Kill. It is about the abortion bombings in the 80s by the group Army of God. It goes through like their Christian understanding of violence and the use of force. And I'm hoping to put that out like early March, April. So please watch out for that on the Gum Road. And we have Jerome with us. How you doing, buddy?
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Dimes, how you doing, fella?
I'm doing great, man. That book sounds interesting. I'm gonna try to get my grubby mitts on that the moment it's out. That's right up my alley. And just to thank you so much for having me on. Great fan, and I've known Dark Enlightenment for, I guess it must be years now,
Jerome.
Yes.
right?
Well, I don't mind. I wear multiple hats, but yes, Dimes is the host of the wonderful variety program, long form interviews, book reviews, chat show, Blood Satellite from our great white neighbor to the north, or great white browning neighbor to the north. I don't know how you would describe.
Well, first of all, I like to call it a diverse show. But yeah, also, it was funny. My co-host Judas, we would have had this discussion a long time ago, but we call Canada the Great White North, and because of the snow, because of the ice. And I remember him saying we would have been well into our 20s by this point, grown man, and he was like, "Oh, I thought they just called us that because of all the white people," and he wasn't joking, and he could be because up until what was it, like the mid 90s, Canada was something like 95% white. I'm making up numbers, but it was mostly that. And so I think for a lot of people, it was either or for the longest time.
Right. I've been recently getting into hockey, just because every other professional sport is terrible. And if you look at like the top 50 scorers for all-time hockey, right? There's Wayne Gretzky, who's Canadian, and then Jaromir Jagr, who's Czech, I think. And then it's just like Canadian guy, Canadian guy, Canadian guy, Canadian guy. And I'm a big fan of the original Canadian flag, the Red Ensign. Both because I just am naturally like reactionary by temperament, and I don't like new things, and I don't trust new things. But it's a very stark of like, this is who we are. We are British, French, Irish in North America. Like we are the British Isles and the French building this new society in this harsh wilderness.
No, I agree completely. And for the longest time, the Red Ensign movement in Canada, I mean, I was familiar with that years and years ago, and it's had a bit of a resurgence lately. The reason I wasn't huge on it many, many years ago, for people who don't know, look up the Canadian Red Ensign. That was the traditional flag of Canada before we got a new one, a new corporatized flag much, much later. But for the longest time, it was the Red Ensign. And to that point, if you see this flag flying now, you can sort of divine the politics of whoever's flying it. And I've seen more of them over the past few years. More people kind of awakening to our points of view. Anyway, point being that I always took issue with the flag a little bit, just because if you look at it, there's the Canadian shield. And that's what a lot of people, when they talk about the Red Ensign, they talk about that. But the flag itself has a great big Union Jack on the far upper left-hand corner. And I always said, they said, we should bring the Red Ensign back, bring that flag back. And I said, you know what? If we're trying to, here's what the people don't want to hear this, but there is an argument to be made for the newer leaf flag. And that there's actually two good things to say. They say, oh, they put a fucking leaf on the flag. Where'd that come from? Well, actually, there's leaves on the Red Ensign, too. That's why they chose leaf. But also, they had to say, look, we want a flag that actually unites Canada, that doesn't have the dominant Anglo influence. Because if you're in Canada, the Anglophones and the Francophones, that would be the English and the French, they've been at odds since its inception, and you're never going to have one subsume the other. The Canadian identity is going to be that permanent bifurcation. Anyway, point being that what I like about just the shield, and you can call that the ensign too, it has all of the cultures and identities present, encapsulated in that shield. And I said, well, that is what people find evocative. That's what people find striking, I think. And that's why that's becoming so popular again. And then there's the 3 leaves in there showing the unity of these cultures. And so if you wanted to get kind of crazy, and you could try and incorporate Aboriginal culture into that if you wanted to create a broader nationalist identitarian movement. And there are talks of that in various sectors of Canada. But as it stands right now, I think that shield's probably the closest thing we've got.
Do you think there could ever be like a Alberta Quebecois nationalist area access in Canada where they can rectify?
Quebec, yeah. Well, Quebec would be the obvious choice because they already do have a very strong nationalist bent to them. Alberta could. Now, what Alberta represents to me is more of an economic center rather than a coherent identity, which isn't to say that they couldn't have one. They could not have some kind of, and there isn't like an Albertan culture. There's an Albertan type of guy. But, to me, the person in Calgary is not terribly different than the person in Toronto. I think there's something about the Alberta culture, but it looks a lot like Texas. It's a lot of cowboy hats. It's a lot of, let's do the same thing as them. So it doesn't seem as strikingly profound as what you would find in Quebec, but it could. But what makes them attractive to an entity like the US would be the oil sands and then what they represent economically to the rest of the country. So if I were America, if I were Trump and I seriously wanted to annex Canada, which he doesn't, but if he did, I wouldn't go after the whole country. I would go after one province. I would go after Alberta.
Do you think, like, under Canada becomes Catholic, do you think that there could be a melding of like the French portion in the and like the cowboy nature of the Wild West nature of Alberta, if it was united under one like the faith?
That's a good question. I suppose like if we snapped our fingers and that were to happen, I'm sure it could. However, that the Quebec is the Catholicism, but it is also the French identity, which is balanced with the Catholicism and it's subsumed within that. But, I tend to think that Quebec is such a culturally and historically distinct area that you'd have to snap your fingers and have a lot of other things fall into place to have that sort of horizontality in Canada. Maybe if Alberta became French too, right? But I think it would make things easier if there was one uniting religion like that. But, I think it would need to be a few other things as well. But that's a very speculative flight of fancy I'm going on there too.
Sure. So I guess we can start off with like how did you come to the faith, or how your experiences converting into it post this post-COVID world you live in?
Yeah, well, I would have converted, I believe, pre-COVID, but not that far before COVID, because I would have converted a couple years before we were married with my wife, and then COVID happened right after the wedding too. So it was in and around there, but that's sort of the same time frame, I suppose. I don't know what led me into it was a very slow period of inquiry and also exposure to it because my wife was born Catholic. And I just got an exposure to it that way because she would go to church and I would go to, and I just got to know it. And then we were talking about this before the show, that new converts have a different approach to this than people who were raised in it. So for better or worse, we have sort of rationalistic priors. Because I was raised, I suppose it's better to set up it this way. I was raised not even atheistic, but more agnostic. I just wasn't told anything about religion I learned about it through The Simpsons. I didn't know what church was, and at one point I went to a friend of mine who I think he would have been a Baptist, I think, or a Protestant, I think. I went to one of the churches. I just didn't know what it was. It was like this odd place. So I had no context, and that's an interesting, albeit anecdotal case study, which is a lot of kids are raised atheistically. Like their parents will tell them that there's no God or this, that. But if you just raise them with nothing and no information whatsoever, what happens? And what happens is they're very confused and startled by the stuff when they just encounter it. So I wasn't raised in any way to dislike it, but I had to sort of apprehend these ideas myself. And then I came to it later in life, but you come to it with a more rationalistic outlook. So, the conversion process, for those who don't know, you have to meet with your priest. You need to get to know the church, and it's like joining a gang. It's like joining the fucking Hell's Angels. You need to hang around, and they want to get to know you, and then you should not interview, but they want to know that you're serious. There's this interesting movie. I wouldn't call it a great film, but it's interesting, called First Reformed. It was one of Paul Schrader's later movies. It's got Ethan Hawke. It's sort of like a Christian Taxi Driver.
Okay.
I might recommend you watch it, but it's a priest, and there's terrorism involved in that, and he's having a crisis of faith as a priest, and one of the issues that he's dealing with is all these young people who are attracted to the religion, but it's very clear they're looking for an army to join. They're looking to join for political reasons. And I could only imagine that Eastern Orthodoxy has to deal with the exact same thing. I think Catholics have to deal with it more so than Lutherans, because there's so many people who want to join the church because they like fucking Warhammer 40K or whatever it is. They like the aesthetics. They like the idea of joining some kind of order, but they're joining for the wrong reasons. And then the reasons that cause them to join will have them leaving it within a year or two. And that's sort of a trend you see, where people go from militant atheist to militant Catholic, and then to militant fucking Eastern Orthodoxy. There's like a track they go on, and then they end up in Islam sometimes, I guess. But they just end up, because they don't want it for the real reasons, which should be very, very inward, serious spiritual inquiry, which is not for someone like myself, and I think a lot of others, that doesn't come naturally. So, but I had to approach it from more of a rationalistic point of view. I had a lot of questions, and you need to recontextualize a lot of stuff. And even after I converted, and this is reflected on the show, especially recently, I liked reading books about it. You should, one of the good things about being a Catholic is you don't need to read the Bible, honk honk. But the idea is that you want to read Thomas Aquinas, you want to read Eastern Orthodoxy writers, you want to read Lutheran writers and Protestant writers, and get a sense of the difference between them. And I don't know, like when I spoke to E. Michael Jones not long ago, not long ago, it was like 2 years ago, but I covered his book Logos Rising, and some people find him a pretty controversial figure. They have, their opinions on what he thinks about race and this or that. But I thought his writings on the history of Logos and the Word of God and the history of the Catholic Church, I thought that was very illuminating. For someone like me, you need stuff like that. And for many Catholics, maybe they don't. Maybe they're raised in it and they are at peace with everything. But for me, it's sort of like a never-ending inquiry, I suppose, even as I'm in it. But the result of that is that I'm the one dragging my wife to church now. So...
God bless
one
you.
of the,
Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that Patrick and I are both cradle Catholics who eventually kind of tried it, I think, is how we ended up where we ended up. But you can't engage in a culture war, and by default, right? You're just engaged in a culture war because the elites in our countries, whether that's whatever you want to say, like put echoes around it, do whatever you want to say, right? Like our country is being invaded. Billions of dollars of our tax money is being spent on, like, literally making the frogs gay, and you can't engage in any kind of cultural conflict without a cultus, right? You have to at least understand the battlefield you're fighting on, if only just to protect your own children, right? And it's really important that young men who I'm a 40K fan too, right? Like, if you're just in it for the aesthetics, there has to be something else there. And the cool aesthetics is a result of the culture, of the cult, of the religious outlook. And that whole idea of secularism was like a sort of compromise after something like the 30 Years' War, which was horrible. And like, basically everyone who believes the Nicene Creed can basically get along, and we just won't choose an official religion amongst ourselves, is a temporary Band-Aid sort of solution over the fact that there's no such thing as a secular society, right? And the problem now is we're dealing with Hindu pagans and like Santeria Cubans and Buddhists and Catholics and Methodists and like all of this stuff. And then you have to say, well, or especially in Europe, right? Islam, but in the United States, right? I live in the Pacific Northwest, right? There's so Microsoft, ever since that one Indian has taken over CEO, basically just flooded the whole I-5 corridor with, Pajeets. And it doesn't matter. Like, wherever I go into town, and thank you very much, sir. It's insane. And
yeah, I agree completely.
And they can have the Diwali festival, and I'm like, well, what about my festival? Like,
part of me is I don't like personally to engage in a lot of interfaith debates, and despite that, they happen all the time in our community because we have, for Blood Salad, we have a fair mix of different faiths. We got quite a few pagans, quite a few atheists, but then there's quite a few Protestants, and then Catholics, and then maybe Catholics are even the fewest. But these debates and these conflicts are so easy to kick off, even when they're good natured. But I just don't like even wading into those waters, because you get these debates and these knife fights that go on for 3 days. But a thought had occurred as I was finishing this book. It was actually recommended by one of my pagan friends, or my he wouldn't call him something. What was it? A Hellenist friend of mine at Fortisax, or maybe he's not. He might take that. With those types of guys, if I say he's a Hellenist, some people hate that. So I'm just going to say pagan because I don't want to offend him. But it's called The Germanization of Medieval Christianity.
Great book.
Yeah. Really, I really like that. And what it was there's one part, we won't go into the whole thing. I'm sure we probably talked about it at various points, but there's an argument made that the feedback of the Germanic peoples back into what was the Catholic Church was one of a few instances of that gave the Catholic Church a distinct Europeanness. And that's something you would say to people who are like, oh, it's just an Eastern incursion. This is like a desert cult. And it's like, not that specific church is distinctly European, and we can show exactly how that happened and how these folk ways were integrated without actually damaging the core faith. And so on top of that, you build from that into Lutheranism, Protestantism, Anglicanism, from that church into the larger sphere of European Christianity. And I think it needs, because there's Christianity that's practiced elsewhere, but actually not that many places, because the book is very careful to show that, they tried this in Japan, it didn't take. They tried it with the Jews, didn't take. There's been a lot of attempts. It seems to be kind of working in Africa, but not really in China. So it seemed to take off in Europe. And I think there's a strong case we made that this entire Western Christian project has an integrated European folkishness or vokishness, if that's what some people like to view it as. And then that is the bedrock that you can build some kind of unity between the Protestants and the Catholics. We don't necessarily need to even snap our fingers, because I say that because there's another book that we had covered on the show, because maybe my non-Catholic friends are ripping their hair out because I'm not mentioning it. It's called Tri-Faith America by, I want to say, Andrew Schultz. I don't think it is. It's some kind of Schultz. Andrew Schultz is a terrible comedian, but it's about the history of Protestant America in, I guess, the early 20th century, early 20th century, and the migration waves of not only, I think it's like the second migration wave of Jews, this very specific type of Jew, and then Catholics came in, and they actually, the subtitle of the book was something to the tune of how Jews and Catholics held America to its Protestant promise, which is to say that there was more or less a Protestant hegemony in America that was threatened by these two migrant groups who were holding it up to its promise of tolerance, because it's easy to be tolerant when everyone's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But then you have these out groups saying, well, that means you must be tolerant to me. And they didn't have an answer for that, and said, okay, sure. And then they started all these, interfaith councils. And I won't go into the whole history of it, but there's a case to be made that it was these two outside groups that sort of carved out their own spaces within America, built their own institutions, and by degrees whittled away the Protestant power in America. So there is a narrative that the Catholic was a foreign invasion. So I'm always trying to look at different ways to say, well, is there a way to frame this in a larger European context? So it's not even necessarily, one doesn't necessarily need to win. There's more unity there than between, as you had said, Hindu paganism or whatever good luck nonsense the Chinese are doing, whatever it might be. I gave you a lot there.
Well, it is fundamentally, right? Like the contradictions in the United States, right? The right now we're kind of undergoing this vibe shift, this realignment, right? The economics aren't working out. CSIS spends more time like listening to friends of mine's podcasts than actually like protecting their country. Which is sad. For those who don't know, CSIS is the Canadian FBI, right? CSIS spends more time like tracking Dimes and Jeremy McKenzie and other people who like think that Canada is actually a real thing and should be a country. Right?
I always wondered if in the offices when they're listening to podcasts, if there's like some favorites, you know what I mean? Like they're listening to JF Garepi, they're listening to Stefan Molyneux, but I'm like, maybe more of them like Blood Satellite. I'm just hypothesizing.
Right. Yeah. Right. I'm sure that there are, and it'll be funny. One of the nice things about being a Christian is that like when I die, and I'll be sitting there in purgatory with like nothing to do, but be like, I'm sorry for my sins, Lord. Oh, that guy was a Fed. No wonder. Like, like you'll know, right?
No
like,
way.
All these sorts of things. This is not to say that any particular person is a Fed or anything, but the contradictions between this Anglo-Protestant Canada and the Quebecois French Canada, right? Very much kind of that tension kind of defined the Canadian project until fairly recently. And in the United States, these confessional and regional tensions kind of define the United States until pretty recently, right? The North versus the South, the high church versus the low church, the Catholics versus the Protestants. And those tensions can lead to problems, and resolving those tensions can either like cause a breakup or like one faction can win and one faction can lose. But there can be some interesting results of something like that. Like Flannery O'Connor is this, wonderful Catholic writer who grew up in like the very, very Protestant South. And she wouldn't have been what she was without that kind of iron sharpening iron sort of thing of being around all these low church Protestants all the time. But when the modern liberal project essentially says our only dogma is that no dogma is acceptable except ours, and you're like, well, where do we limit that dogma, right? Like, like you see it all the time, right, with these James Lindsay, Bill Maher, right? Like, I was a pot smoking Jewish hippie. What's the deal with this like tranny stuff? Like, I thought we were like okay with the butt marriage and the weed, and then we were just like everyone was free and everything was cool, and we were just gonna be cool. Like, what's the problem? Like, confused old man who smoked too much weed for 50 years is like, wait a minute, like, oh, like stuff burns down, like, yes, dumbass, like you destroyed your society, and now lo and behold, it's destroyed and doesn't function because
I will say though, I'm gonna miss that guy when he's gone, because I had a old creative director at an agency I worked at. For the listeners who don't know, I work in marketing, and advertising. But he was that type of guy. Would he have been a baby boomer or like an old Gen X? I call them old Gen X just because of how they dress. But he was like that. Like, I call them, they're liberal, like what we call them, liberal progressives who still want to say the word retard. You know what I mean? Like they listen to black voices, but also they kind of want to make racist jokes. I thought we were cool. I thought we legalized weed in Canada. And I really think every single one of them thought that everything was going to be cool from then on, because they really do think that if everyone gets high, then it's like John Lennon's Imagine. This was
right.
the generation that really, really took that to heart. And so, but one day they're going to be gone. And I think I'm going to miss them. I'm going to miss that type of dumbass just being around.
Yeah. Well, and of course, Bill Maher is, half Jewish, half Catholic, who was liberal and, is all like, wait, I grew up in this wonderful environment and it was so wonderful. And no one had to lock any doors. And then, but also like celebrates with, Shannon Osbourne.
Yeah. Because the older he gets, the more confused he's going to get. It's like his entire show was Club Random, one of America's worst shows. But he's just on there with the Gen X dress, which is like a t-shirt and then I think like a flannel overshirt. He's really wearing that and just getting drunk and saying, what, huh? Like he's just like, he gets on and he's confused with a guest for an hour and why society is the way it is. I'm like, I'm watching this guy disintegrate, this man evaporate before my eyes. But I'm like, I'm going to miss the evaporating guys.
Oh, sorry. I had myself muted. He couldn't, right? He's sitting there with Sharon Osbourne, the other Michelin. And it's so great that London's not English anymore. But also, like, I grew up in a cohesive society and like no one had to lock the doors. And that was great. And my parents were married, even though they didn't like each other. But, well, bro, one thing led to the other.
Yeah, Bill Maher's, it's wild because I saw 2 clips back to back, and I believe they were released in quick succession. One was him saying what you just said, which was like, I'm glad that England isn't English anymore and it's just a hodgepodge or a polyglot boarding house, whatever it might be. And then next week, he's on his show saying things were a lot better when the white men were in charge, and then the crowd cheering. And I'm looking at him like, what do you think is going on? I puzzle at these people. I don't know if I can get that. I'm just in a permanent state of being enraged, but I'm also old as shit. So I can't be angry with the vigor of a 23-year-old me, but I'm in awe that I'm like, what is it like to be you? And they use that term cognitive dissonance, but I do wonder, I'm like, which part do you think is more true? I think we know, because like you said, Bill Maher, he's one of the, I can't think of a person who was more hostile towards white Christian America than Bill Maher for most of his life. And then I guess he's just pivoted because Oh, they just started chopping kids' balls off. What happened there? I'm like, you happened. That's you. I'm going to point at you until you die, that this was all you and your friends. And that's one thing that guys like him, they have this power that I've never been able to really wrap my head around, which is that they can literally deny that the things they said a year ago.
Right. E. Michael Jones is like, you're blaming boomers for destroying America, but you might as well blame all right-handed people. Like, Dr. Jones, I love you. I've interviewed you. You're wonderful in a lot of ways, but
Yeah.
but you're completely wrong on this one. Like,
you got the same thing where everyone just because you interviewed him like I did, anytime he says something bad, they bring it to you. So look what your boy's doing.
like,
Well, you have to answer for that. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know. Like, this is the problem with running interview shows.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm gonna get like, did you know he's Canadian? Like, look at what Justin Trudeau did. Like, I know. Justin Castro's gay, dude. Why did you talk to Dimes? Like,
like, look, we were the first ones calling him gay.
Yeah,
we knew the thing. And we've been saying he's been Justin Castro's kid forever. We're on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the funny thing about Trudeau, though, that we hated him for so long that when everyone else started hating him, which was really during COVID, that's when you started seeing by the way, I apologize if I've been cursing on the show. I don't want to have a misconstrue about your audience, but the F Trudeau bumper stickers, they start coming out really during COVID. But I'm like, he's been the same guy the whole time. It's been like 4 or 5 years. What happened? But we've been against him the entire time. He's been a freak the whole time. He's been smiling wrong. He's been dressing up in odd costumes. His head's all fucked up looking. You know what I mean? Like, what changed? So
yeah, no, he's been terrible the entire time, and he's been awful. And I'm pretty sympathetic to Canada for lots of reasons.
Well, here's the thing. One of the ways I wasn't sympathetic was because, again, he was voted in sort of a nepotistic sort of way. Honestly, a lot of people voted for him because they liked his hair. I'm not joking. And they'll still stand by that now if you ask them. And his head of hair is serviceable. Yes. But and also they really, really wanted weed legalized, and he became the weed guy. And then weed was legalized here. And it was already practically legal for the entire time. No one got arrested for smoking weed in Canada, but he made it official. My view on that is that it leads to schizophrenia eventually. That's one of the studies that they don't like to talk about. But yeah, schizophrenia goes up. But whatever, I guess,
Well, and not only that, but like, I'm my mid 40s now, so like, how many guys did I graduated from high school in the late 90s, and I'm like that last guy. In many ways, I'm the last guy out, grabbing the skid on the helicopter out of Hanoi, right? I was able to like get married and have kids without being completely destroyed, and I remember a normal America. Nobody who's younger than me, remembers normal America as an adult. I was a young man, but I remember like a normal world,
Me too. That's weird, isn't it? And it doesn't seem that long ago.
And I know at least half a dozen people who were, bright people with a future who literally just smoked it. They smoked their future away. And they're probably dozens to scores in my circle of acquaintances who just made weed their personality, and it ruined their lives.
Yeah, look at it this way. When you behold an addict of meth, of crack, of anything, you witness them and you want to help them. You feel pity. You want to drag them out of that hole. When you see someone that addicted to weed, you want to kill them. Like, there's no pity for the weed addict. I'm like,
at least beat them severely.
Yes. Like, there's nothing worse than a guy who's like too into weed. And that's not only their personality, that's their politics. And you saw this with like Steven Crowder when he was on Joe Rogan, where he said, maybe marijuana isn't a miracle drug from God, and that he freaked out on Steven Crowder. Like you can't admit that weed is a little bit bad. Like you smoke it, you inhale smoke. Maybe vaping's different, right? Or CBD and all that shit. But I'm like, you have to understand, if you're taking bong rips all throughout the day, that has to have an effect. You know what I mean? And I'm a guy, like, I used to drink all the time. I haven't drank in 4 years, but there's an understanding that this pickles your brain, and there's no understanding in the world of weed for most of them. Weed world.
Right. Well, and this is where I put on my reactionary cap. If democracy gets you Justin Trudeau or George W. Bush or whatever, like, what use is democracy? Right? Like, he has nice hair. I've pointed this out, but like, for at least the last 30 years, like, the election in the United States has been like, whichever presidential candidate made the most housewives feel funny in like Ohio and Pennsylvania. Like,
it's the same thing up here, and that was my original point.
1984 to like 2016, or it was like, could I see like, it was like Barack Obama's that handsome foreign lover type or whatever, like, or
no, you know what? Okay, Barack Obama's probably the best example, because they had said that Trudeau was like our Obama. I heard real people say that. And that was the point I was making, just to circle back to that, which is that Trudeau was voted in once and he was terrible for many, many years. And then he was voted in again resoundingly. And that really made me rejigger my expectations. I thought, well, obviously the Canadians are going to vote more conservative, and maybe my fixation at that point was on the People's Party of Canada, the PPC, which is not a far right party, but it's further right. I would call it more aggressively libertarian. But the leader, Maxime Bernier, he talks more openly about migration issues. He echoed a lot of, not most, but enough things that we would talk about that the Conservatives never would. And I just saw them get curb stomped every election. Like, they would get 1%, and then they would get less than 1% the next one. So I'm like, this isn't even trending in the right direction, because I would only call it a third party, because within Canada there's several parties, but it's understood there's two main parties, Liberal and Conservative, then the satellites around that. So the NDP is further left than Liberals, the PPC would be further right. But the idea was, okay, if we can see that the PPC is trending up, that means they're going to force the Conservatives to reckon with the fact that people are becoming more attracted to that sort of speech. But then if it's going the opposite direction, which it did, I'm like, okay, so then I really feel like a minority in my own country. There's really no one, or not enough people, who are really on my side with any of this, with like the basics on, is mass migration bad? Now it's changed within the past couple of years, but for a while there, I'm like,
it was so flooded.
Yeah, for a while there, I'm like, I don't know, what do I do? I don't know, because in America you had Trump, and the one thing Trump did, regardless of what you feel about Trump, the first time and the second time was like, maybe I'm not alone. Maybe there's something. Maybe there's a momentum. Maybe I'm not crazy, because you've been told you're crazy your whole life. So on a personal level, I think people are invigorated by that. Like, there was nothing like that up here. So it's a very lonely path to walk, and you feel like it's not impossible, but you realize that you need to start further back, further back.
Well, like, I've paid as reasonably close attention to Canadian politics for probably 20 years now. In fact, more than 20 years, because I can remember when Ezra Levant and Mark Stein got sued under Section 13, and they got it repealed, and I like donated money to Ezra all those years ago. Like good luck finding my credit card, buddy. When he was still at the Western Standard before he started Rebel News, and this is ancient history now, but because I saw then, and I still believe that all Anglophone nations are kind of under the same spell of like this Anglo-liberal philosophy, and that it was going to, if it was a problem in America or if it was a problem in Canada, it was going to come to the United States, or it was going to come to Australia, it was going to come to New Zealand, and eventually be a problem in Europe. And you see that essentially in the 60s, every Anglophone nation was like, we don't have this population of obstinate Africans who are just like a constant fetter around our ankle that we have to drag around everywhere. We should have one so we're like America, and you see them all doing this, and it's crazy, right? It's absolutely insane that anyone would be like, what we need? This unassemblable population of really stupid people who are incredibly violent.
Yeah.
And you see it in Canada and the United Kingdom, and Europe to a lesser extent. And the fact that Trudeau sucks and has always sucked is obvious to those of us who are paying attention. The problem is that in 2007, right, the opposition to Trudeau wasn't someone who actually got their head on straight. It was Ezra Levant. And I used to like Ezra, and now I understand what a poisonous person he is, and I don't particularly care for him. But it's that through control of the discourse, and that maybe with your advertising background, I think that's one of the very valuable things you bring to the table. How much of what people think is just the expectations set by the media and advertising is insane, right? Because oh, look at those crazy people who believe the crazy things, and then you're like, well, I guess they're crazy. Well, no, Maxime Bernier is not my cuppa, but he's way more sane than anybody else. Jagmeet Singh, this this Pajit with the NDP, who's basically like, all white people must give us all their money forever.
Yeah, a lot of them, everyone who's listening to this show and listens to our show is probably used to being heterodox. They're used to getting fired or losing relationships, or having these fights every time you see your family. But most people don't want to do that, and the problem is that the media has a profound cooling effect on all of us. One of the things, an example of that even on our side, was a lot of people think this is a controversial take, but the Unite the Right rally, everyone kind of remembers that. Or maybe they don't. I don't know if young people remember that, but that had one of the most insane cooling effects I've ever seen. We became the pitiless censors of ourselves after Unite the Right. If people remember before and after that, it was really after that everyone started policing the language, looking for feds, looking for people who would get them in trouble. Everyone really clammed up, and we haven't really emerged from that, in my opinion, because like you, I've been around for quite some time. The show's been around for many years, but I've been around, so I remember before and after that. So people may not remember a time where we weren't always ravenously accusing each other of being feds and worried that, incorrectly or incorrectly, that there's a lot of stuff we can't talk about. So the idea is that the media can also control that. So in Canada, especially, you feel very alone with these ideas. You can't talk about it openly. They do, as you'd said, make you feel like you are crazy. And then they turn, it's okay if the media convinces you that you're crazy. You don't give a shit, right? But they'll convince your friends and your family. And most people don't want to sacrifice all of their relationships. And it's difficult for me to ask young men to even go on that path with me, because I'm already on it. Even with face doxing and stuff, people say unless your identity is revealed, you're a coward and you should get offline and you should reveal yourself. I can't make that argument for people. I don't want to tell young men to unnecessarily sacrifice their jobs, their careers, the careers of their moms or their wives or whoever. You know what I mean? I think it's irresponsible for people to be saying that if your stated goal is the well-being of your people, Anyway, we're getting off track there a little bit. That's just a side rant.
I think it's worth talking about because I probably in a fairly unique position in that I've talked to almost everyone who's supposed to speak at Unite the Right at one time or other in the last 15 years, but I've been around for that long. And so, 15 years ago, it wasn't that hard to be in touch with literally everybody. You just had to be on Twitter and, be willing to talk to people. And one of the things that is changing, but is nevertheless still a risk is right. In Germany, you can get arrested for making fun of a politician, public figures. Americans are uniquely privileged. Why? One of the reasons I talk to Canadians, talk to South Africans, talk to, New Zealand, people in New Zealand, Kiwis, and or people in the UK is that I have a First Amendment right. And so I feel like I have to talk about my brothers in these other countries because I have the right that they don't. And, watching people get their bank account taken for just supporting the truckers, was insane and scary and, depressing and God bless those guys who, persevered and, I think several of them got their stuff overturned and some people have won court cases, but, most people just don't have the resources to fight that sort of thing or the psychological strength. And they don't have the kind of relationships that would enable them to support that. Like how many people got divorced over COVID?
Yeah.
How many people lost, I know people who committed, or I know of people who committed suicide. I know people that, don't talk to me anymore. Because I didn't get vaccinated. I know people who don't have non-vax people in their homes, 5 years later. It's been 5 years since the world lost its mind, really. And that's all media. And I think that what our side of the fence has done better than anything that we've done, and now there's been a lot of mistakes and a lot of pluses and minuses since that August day in 2017. And I know several people that were there. Like I was not there myself, but I know lots of people who were there. And the thing that we didn't understand is that we were going to war with the system, and the system is both vastly powerful and evil. And what we've done in the years since slowly is kind of undermine its legitimacy and replace its information systems with our own. Like I don't need to watch CBC anymore. I can just listen to yourself or Jeremy McKenzie or Fortisax or whatever. There's a number of Canadian Stefan Molyneux, right? Like if I want to know what's going on in Canada, I have sources.
Yeah. And also let me just say that I'm sure there's a lot of crossover with your show and the Third Rail. So there might very well be a lot of, TRS listeners who tune in. We've always defended, or at least I've always defended the Unite the Right rally. Because I remember in the wake of that event, a lot of people denounced it and said they should have done that. And I took the opposite approach. I said they should have done it every month. This should be happening absolutely. All the fucking time.
And I agree completely. And, John A. MacDonald, right, the first Canadian Prime Minister, whatever you might think of him, is the founder of his country and a statesman and someone important in history. Right. And essentially the logic of the people who were against or who were pro taking down the Lee statue has extended to Canada, and they're starting to take down statues of John A. Macdonald. It's like, well, there were no slaves in Canada.
Yeah. Oh, and also just to touch on the Robert E. Lee statue, and we've gone on record fairly recently by saying that, you remember when they actually burned and melted down the Robert E. Lee statue, and all of the conservatives, the conservosphere, was up in arms about that. How dare they? And that really evocative photo of the red melting face of Robert E. Lee was circulating.
That will make me angry till the day I die.
I said, you guys, I don't hear the Unite the Right rally brought up because they were the only people trying to save that fucking statue. None of you. Where were you? Where were you? where the fuck was Tucker Carlson? Where were any of these people? And now you want to get mad? Fucking spare me. And the same thing with Sir Johnny MacDonald. There's only a few people up here who are really standing by our first prime minister, who's got statues in my hometown where I was born, in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. That was also where he was born, and that's where the original Parliament of Canada actually was. That's why their city hall is so cool. But there's statues everywhere. And here's a funny story. A little inside baseball for those who don't know. A lot of the statues they took down, Sir John MacDonald, I know of at least two. They'd never melted them down. They just put them into storage because, like you had said, there really was no reason. This was just some kind of reciprocal, this is the thing we're doing now. We're taking down colonial stuff. But even the cities that you found them in, just put them into storage because they're like, we'll put them back up later. We don't know what's going on. But there is this understanding up here that this is silly and made up. However, what infuriates me is that even in Canada, in my hometown of Kingston, they had this very famous pub called Sir John A's Public House, which was the place that he would go to drink because he was a fall down drunk, which is very cool. It's from an era where politicians were all drunk and shooting each other. It was a great time to be alive.
And he was Scottish. Like, yeah, you expect a Scot, who's living in, like, the only difference between Scotland and Nova Scotia is Nova Scotia's got worse weather. Like,
that's why, like, as I said, I used to be a pretty big drunk and I haven't drank for a while. But I'm like, man, I'm just really stuck out of time. Because if I was back then, I could have been running everything. If we're judging this by how successful a drunk is by how much they drink. But they changed the name of Sir John's Public House to just the Public House. And then it closed down a year after. But I'm like, that's a piece of history that was still in operation that the owner felt guilty about the name. And that obviously chased away all the legacy people who go there just because the fucking, imagine
right.
like go to George Washington's bar.
Yeah.
And then they just changed the name to the Wash House. What the fuck? And then,
right.
what I mean? It's disgraceful.
Well, and this brings up the religious thing, right? Like, there's this anti-white, anti-Western, anti-Christian animus is religious in character. It's not rational. It's not like we made this argument and therefore these things. Like, no, it's just this is bad because we think it's bad for religious reasons. And this is why this whole, like, go along, get along, neutrality Christianity is useless, because we're dealing with a religion. We're not dealing with an argument. Like, you and I can have an argument about the United States annexing Alberta, but we share base premises, and these people just don't. Their base premise is like anything white, Christian, or European is bad.
Yeah, and it doesn't take them long to admit that. This is, I'm promise I'm not trying to make this all about Israel, but one of the lines I would say to people in attempting to reveal Zionist influence in America, I would say, you're dealing with two major political parties that cannot even come to terms on what gender means or if borders should exist. But the one thing that they agree on is that Israel is our greatest ally and deserves an infinite money cheat code. Right. But that is to highlight that we don't share any of the definitions of this other side. And by the other side, there's a lot of different titles you could give it, and they're all somewhat valid. So, Edward Dutton and the biology side would say these are dysgenic people. And they would be right. Oftentimes they are just straight mentally ill and ugly and gross, spiteful mutants is the terminology he uses. That someone else might say, oh, they're Marxist, cultural Marxist or Marxist. That is true. And that's true insofar that Marxism tends to attract the dysgenic a lot of the time. Or it is also the failure of liberalism to present a counterpoint to the question. Just like we were saying with Tri-Faith America, that book, the Protestant nation was unable to answer the questions posed to it, but why don't you tolerate us as well, which is in fact what happened in Canada. And we discussed this in the short film I did with a few other people called Paving Over the Public. And it was the history of mass migration in Canada. How did Canada become this multicultural nation? And like a lot of places, we were not tolerant towards immigration, but perhaps more tolerant towards European migration, but then not even that much, because back then, based on public opinion polls, we didn't like Ukrainian migration that much either.
Right,
But
but like, if
it
you're
was
in
always
Ontario,
understood. There was always understood that you certainly don't want Africans. However, over the course of the preceding decades, certain groups, certain NGOs, certain agitation groups said, well, why not Africans? Why not the Indians? And then you didn't have an answer to that because they didn't want to sound racist. But it was those who were posing the question. They are involved as well. And so there's many different inputs to this problem, but kind of it's the outside attacking this one coherent center, this one sort of not an ethnogenesis, but a identitarian center, trying to fracture it as much as possible.
yeah, like an ethno-religious cultural stronghold, that they're all just, and to be perfectly fair to the WASP American, like the Catholics did team up with the Jews to attack the WASPs in America. Like that is a fact. It was a mistake, right?
And that's why I say, like, it did happen, but what now? What can we do? Let's operate with that historical knowledge and say, what can we do to bridge the gap, to whatever might be, for our own survival. And that's underscoring this entire thing, is we are speaking in terms of our actual survival, because this ends with people, like I always tell people, you are in a race war right now. This is what it feels like. It's slow and it's a slow boil, but this is basically, we talk about it all the time. We fill our shows with reporting on it. Every insane, egregious act, every criminal that gets away with it, the society's tolerance of it, George Floyd, like this is it. This is what it feels like. So when we talk about this, it's not just complaining about the news. It's like, well, this is in the interest of our survival. And it is important to talk about it. It is important to explain this to people, because the problem is so big to so many normal people that they can't even look at it. They can't believe that it's that big. And when you talk to them, your family, your friends, reasonable people, intelligent people, successful people, this problem is so multifaceted that it's like looking at the great old ones from Lovecraft or something. Like, you look at it, you kind of go insane. But that's a hard sell. It's hard to tell my mom that, look over here, be insane like me. But it's a process you have to kind of walk them through as well. So I think you might be muted as well.
No, I was muted. I was looking something up, a hockey stat. But anyway, like, right. So Mark Messier, like this is just the top 10 hockey scorers of all time. Wayne Gretzky has more points than anybody else by like a huge margin. He has more assists than the next leading scorer, right? Jaromir Jagr, Mark Messier, Gordon Howe, Ron Francis, Marcel Dion, Steve Yzerman, Mario Lemieux, Joe Sakic, and Phil Esposito. Like, all of those guys are Canadian.
I believe it. I mean, because hockey up here is like football in America, in the sense that a lot of guys, even if they don't follow it professionally, they played it as a kid. Like, I played hockey for many, many years growing up. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but like you had said, I come from an era where everyone played it. If it wasn't on the ice, it was street hockey or road hockeys. Yeah.
Right. No, you have to, other than Jaromir Jagr and Ovechkin's number 11. So this is from quanthockey.com, and I'm bringing this up for a reason, not just because like I like hockey, but like, okay, so the top 20 leading scorers in the history of the NHL. Number 2 is Jaromir Jagr, a Czech. Number 11 is Alexander Ovechkin, a Russian. Number 18 is Timu Samalame from Finland, and 23 is Yaru Kari in Finland, and number 25 is Brett Hull, who's American and he's Canadian. So, an American dual citizen. Everybody else on that list is Canadian. Gordie Howe, Ron Francis, Marcel Dion, Steve Yasherman, Mario Lemieux, Sid Crosby, Joe Sakic, Phil Esposito, Ray Baruch, Joe Thornton, Mark Recchi, right? And most people aren't interested in thinking about culture a lot. They just want to live their culture. And to them, and I'm slightly jealous that the show title Honky Night in Canada, that's just brilliant for anybody who's ever watched Coach Cherry. The idea that you need to turn a critical eye towards something as foundational as the Red Ensign or hockey or pick your thing, right? In the United States, the Stars and Stripes or the Stars and Bars, right? Like, most people aren't equipped to do that temperamentally. They're not equipped to be like, well, I love this thing, but also I'm going to be really critical of it.
That's true.
And it's a very difficult thing to do, right? Because I want to be the guy that, like, just hears the Star Spangled Banner and, like, gets, like, the manly tear in my eye and holds my hand over my heart. But I also have this, like, seething hatred of what the United States has become, because USA stands for uterine sodomy and abortion, right? like that's what that's for practical purposes, that's what we do, right? Like usury via our central bank and World Economic Forum and the World Bank, right? Like, we have all this dollar dominance, and we use it to make sure, like, look, you have to make sure that people can do butt sex in Botswana. We're going to spread condoms and pay for abortions, and like my roads look like the dark side of the moon, and you're killing babies in Vietnam with my money. Like, what? That's insane. Like, why?
That's what I loved about that recent news. Despite what you might think or anyone might think about Elon Musk and the Doge thing, but revealing where so much taxpayer money was specifically going, it really did show that what a lot of people had intuited for many years, like, none of this can be organic. None of this is just a emergent cultural revolution that the younger generation is just super gay. No, it's like hundreds of billions of dollars were directed at trying to normalize this stuff, not only in America, but abroad through soft propagandistic power in all throughout Africa, the Middle East, trans theater, whatever it might be. Think of a kooky thing, and your tax dollars were going to, like, directly promote it to your children and the children of others around the world.
I think I've talked about this, but I guarantee you're an ad guy. Like, what is with, like, every ad has a hot redhead or a hot blonde with a black dude?
I think it's probably even worse in the UK. Almost everything I see coming out of, because also look at it this way, it tilts more towards state-sponsored ads too. Like, if you look at the BBC, it seems that their shows, they push a very specific type of interracial pairing that we all know. But then even the private companies, maybe it's less, but then oh, this is an official government mandate, which means that they would prefer ads that also reflect this. There's probably a lot of reasons for that, because everyone knows when they talk about diversity, it just means more black. And a lot of conservatives get hung up on, it's like, well, if it was real diversity, you would have more Asians and Indians. But what you really want to say is, I don't want none of that. I don't like that. It's just more black people. I also don't want more Asians or anything, right? But the reason that is, maybe that goes away. Maybe that's on its way out. It'll take maybe a couple more years. I don't know, because everyone talked about the Super Bowl ads. If you looked at the Super Bowl ads in Trump's America, there were still multiracial or even pro-black. However, all those ads would have been recorded and shot and planned like 9 months ago. So maybe there is some cultural reverberating factors that will kind of usher some of that out. And maybe that aspect of wokeness is going away only because it's just gay and no one likes it. But you are correct in saying the fact that it is mostly black male plus white female means that they're prioritizing a black male narrative, which is, separate than the black female narrative. Like there's almost two anti-white narratives going on at the same time, because the black female one is almost more theory based, and the black male one is just purely destructive, and it's purely like violent and humiliating. Whereas like if you like the types who are embracing Marxist theory are the black women, so it's a different thing. So the why would be probably anything you could imagine, which is just like they're trying to deface and defile what they think is a white male thing. They're trying to enrage a demographic that they either don't think is important or they don't want to be important anymore. So there's an economic case to be made that, well, you could show that they need you. This is what happened with Bud Light. Some people think we're past that, but I'm like, no, return to that. Bully Bud Light, mash their face into the mud, and make them feel stupid for what they did. It's not going to win every battle, but it's one that you did win.
You win. It's how you win. Right? This is the you can just do things, right? Like I'm not 100% sold on Trump because I want results. I want more results. There's been a lot of great talk. I want the U.S. out of Germany. Like I want NATO gone, because NATO right now is like City of London bureaucrats and Brussels bureaucrats being like, your kids need to get drafted and die so that we can continue to have our cushy jobs, and the U.S. government is on the hook for our military while we spend money on a welfare state and like have these Muslims invade. And you can't visit like Notre Dame Cathedral because Muslims burned it down as a Catholic, and you've got to pay for it. But also like just all these contradictions, right? And Trump, to the extent that he exposes this stuff and causes these problems, and I will be the first to admit that he's done a lot of good things in terms of talking. I am personally waiting to see until he actually implements things before I, just go, all in. But if he does what he says he's, if he implements the stuff he's said in the last month, he will be the greatest president in the history of the United States. Period.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, I'm no Trump fanboy, and we've been clear on that on the show, that when he does something that you like, you should cheer. When he does something you don't like, get up in his grill, do what you've been doing, which is everything within your power. And sometimes that's just stirring up stuff online, but that does move the needle, because if it doesn't, then why do anything? If it doesn't, then delete your fucking account. You see what I'm saying? But I'm not a trust the plan guy. And there's a lot of people who they like what Trump's doing, so they're saying, okay, trust the plan, let him do what he does. Like, no, you gain nothing from trusting the plan. I can guarantee you that you won't get what you want if you shut up. If you voice your opinion, I'm not trying to be a populist here, but if you get angry online, you maybe have a 1% chance, but it's better than nothing, which is all you get when you shut up. So hold him to account. You should know what you want. You should like it when you get closer to that. And I'm not of the mind that we benefit by further persecution. And I know that's a divisive topic on this side, that anytime, I'll give you the example, and I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but I remember there was some controversy with Devin Stack from Blackpilled, who I'm a great fan of, and as are many of our listeners. He had said that it was bad that the January 6th prisoners were being released because that served to radicalize us, our side. And I had said, everyone said, oh, he's too black-pilled. And I said, well, if there's one guy who's allowed to be black-pilled, would it not be the guy named Black-pilled? Like, if Donald Trump elected himself king, I could tune into King-pilled and expect him to have some positive thoughts about that. You know what I mean? So I'm like, yeah, if there's one guy who's allowed to be blackpilled, sure. However, I disagreed insofar as I don't think we benefit from that. If that were the case, then we would benefit from that chilling effect that Unite the Right cause. Did any of us benefit from that? Did any of us benefit from James Fields being in prison? No. Furthermore, the January 6th guys, all we're doing is having other people be on the line for us. And then it didn't help us at all. And if they're released, I don't think that makes it worse for us. And I think any freedom that we have to say what we want is better. I don't think we're more effective the more we're persecuted. And some people disagree with that because they're accelerationists in the sense they need to the entire
completely
system.
Correct in that.
Yes.
Like, not only like if we wanted to really save that R.E. Lee statue, Unite the Right should have been like, should have been the convicting thing that conservatives have been like, look, man, if only the neon Nazis are the ones smart enough to understand that. And, some conservatives did understand this. Notable Canadian columnist and, former guest host for Rush Limbaugh pointed this out. Is like, no, you're seeding the ground. And once you seed the principle, you've seeded the whole argument. I think pickup artists are generally kind of degenerate and not a fan because I have kids. But one of the things that they said years ago is completely true, and that's buy the frame, buy the farm. And if you buy into the leftist frame of the argument, then you've seeded 90% of it. Then you're just debating over whether, well, I don't think that butt plugs should be mandatory to go to public school. Like, you shouldn't have to wear one, right?
What was that meme? You probably know what it is, but it was like conservatives from the year 2037. And it was like, back in the day, we had base trannies. We had the real trannies. I don't like these new ones. You know what I mean? Like, they just... I guess I don't want to, even for this show, necessarily make it all about race, but you see this with the multipolarity advocates sometimes where they get you to agree that whiteness is inherently evil, and then they'll go to Europeans a lot of the time and try and convince and make them admit, oh, we're not white. I'm not white. I'm Italian. I'm not white. I'm Irish. I hate white people too. So you recruit Europeans into hating whiteness. However, everyone around the world, from Africans to Middle Easterners to South Americans, they know that white just means European. So you're not really fooling anyone where it really matters. You're not ensuring your own survival. And you can go, and I always use this example, go to a bar in Nigeria and you've got an Irishman, a Frenchman, and an Anglo. You're the three white guys. And you could debate all day about the ethnography and the history between them. The world doesn't care. China doesn't care. They have one word for you, and it's like the white guy. So, but they try and get you to enter their frame by getting white people to accept that whiteness is evil.
Well, it's been a theme of the show that, God is a white supremacist. If being on time and having the agency to do prayers, and even what do you want to do? Spreading the faith. Like, these are all things that we're called to do, but like, this can only be done by the white man. Pushing back on, I guess, not to use cultural Marxism as a foil. Catholicism at the end of the day is, a white supremacy religion. You have to be polite. You have to use manners. You have to not sin, and that's inherent to as the Christianized Europe. So I'm glad you guys are pushing back on the multipolarity stuff. As America declines, sure, there's going to be a rise in power, taking power vacuums. Sure, absolutely, but that doesn't mean we need to cheer it on.
Yeah, and also, just so if people don't listen to Blood Satellite, one of the things we do nearly every episode, we read a book. I treat these ideas very seriously. We've read books from leftists. I do a show with my friend, the Prudentialist, called Do You Even Read? And we cover a lot of leftist literature. We treat it seriously. We read it thoroughly. I usually don't come out the other end liking it, but even with the multipolarity guys, we've read Dugan. and I've spoken to many multipolarity guys, and I'm open-minded insofar as I want to treat these ideas seriously. However, I do, at the end of it, I'm very clear on what I don't like about it, or where I think, here's some parts I do like, here's some parts I don't like. Overall, I think it's an op in some sense. I don't like to use that word too frivolously, and I don't. There's some multipolarity guys who listen to our show, but they know where I stand. They're not going to be surprised by this, but I'm like, honestly, I think this works against the interests of my people.
Well, the great Joe Sobran, I'm sure you've heard the quote before, but he said that like the rest of the world like sees everything, and I could pull it up, but I don't remember it exactly. But basically, paraphrasing the great Joe Sobran, we're resented because everyone else is a white supremacist too. Right? Like, how do you know a black guy has made it in the NBA? White model girlfriend. Right? Like the Middle Eastern guys who are in Europe, what do they want? They want a blonde German girlfriend. Why? Right? Like, the Chinese will flex on each other, but like, I can't digest milk, but I'm going to drink a bunch of it. And like, like it, and some of them have civilizations that are, something to be proud of. The Japanese, the Chinese, some other parts of Asia, but the simple fact of the matter is that up until the last 5 years, maybe from the year 1500 to certainly the year 2010, world history was a contest between bearded white guys from, tertiary seas of the North Atlantic, right? Like the Mediterranean, the North Sea, the Gulf of, Bay of Bothnia, right? Like,
yeah,
like the only people that mattered were Europeans on the world stage, and some people never have, right? Like you can make a case that the Indians, subcontinental Indians, or the Chinese, or the Japanese, or whatever, have mattered in world history, but
I agree completely. I'd say that even our appreciation of these ancient cultures is symptomatic of our whiteness. Is I'm not sure that China has the same reverence for India that white people do, and vice versa. India does not have the same reverence for China that Europeans do, because we have a deeper, more inquisitive mind into the deep history, which is why we had so many fucking museums. We're obsessed with that. One example I would give, just to add on to what you were saying, and I don't know where you or your audience land on the moon landing, but I'm going to use it to illustrate this point, that the reason we went to the moon was because it was there and something was pulling us there, that ultimate frontier. The reason everyone else wants to go to the moon is because white people went there. And that's been the case of human history. There is a unmistakable and profound confidence that comes with being a Westerner. I'm using that term very broadly, but a European, and maybe I'm just speaking more in the Anglo context because that's my prejudice, but there's always been a profound confidence of, I'm going to do this and I actually don't give a fuck what any of you think. I'm going to go to the bottom of the ocean. It would never occur to any of you to want to go to the bottom of the ocean. In fact, we're made fun of constantly for wanting to do that. You ever hear a black person talk about what white people are up to? They don't understand why we want to climb the tallest mountain. They think it's silly. They think it's white people shit. And you know what? As I've gotten older, I actually just agree with them. Yeah, it is white people shit. You're right. It's just our thing. It's our weird thing we like to do. You don't get it. None of you will ever get it. But we don't what you think doesn't fucking dictate what we do, and you'll never understand that either.
No, and it's why you'll never do what we've done.
That's why we want to go to Mars. How many Indians want to go to Mars? None. you want to work for Elon Musk kind of because you want to be in like a palace, but
Well,
and there's a religious argument. I understand that we shouldn't
well,
go to the transhumanism route, but
they'd go to Mars if there were white women there.
yes.
Like,
but also I don't even want to get into the whole like transhumanist space travel thing. I spoke with a good friend of mine named Last Things on this very topic about what is the sort of the Christian or religious or even spiritual response to wanting to colonize other planets. So I don't even want to rehash that here, but just to say that there's something driving us to do that is not present, I don't think, in other groups.
no. And this is the Joe Sobran quote I was thinking of. Joe Sobran, a staunch traditionalist Catholic himself. The concept of envy, the hatred of the superior, has dropped out of our moral vocabulary. Liberalism has fuzzy ideas of historical guilt, but not original sin or pride or envy, which is pride's obverse. The idea that white Christian civilization is hated more for its virtues than its sins doesn't occur to us because it's not a nice idea. None of the sins aren't considerable, but to the envious, sin is more forgivable than virtue. Western man towers over the rest of the world in ways so large as to be almost inexpressible. It's Western exploration, science, and the conquest that have revealed the world to itself. All the races feel like subjects of Western power long after colonialism, imperialism, and slavery have disappeared. The charge of racism puzzles whites who feel not hostility, but only baffled goodwill because they don't grasp what it really means: humiliation. The white man presents an image of superiority even when he isn't conscious of it. And superiority excites envy. Destroying white civilization is the inmost desire of the League of Designated Victims we call, quote, minorities. Joe Sobran, liberty, equality, and diversity. And to bring that back to Canada real quick, right? The Pajit has literally no athletic accomplishments whatsoever. Like the of the Olympic medals won by India, 1.4 billion people, right, by itself. And if you add in Bangladesh and Pakistan, we're looking at 1.7 billion people, because Pakistan's got like 200 billion people and Bangladesh has 100 million people, right? Look at Bangladesh. It's the size of like Nebraska, and it has 80 million people in it. You white man cannot fathom the number of people that just living cheek by jowl on top of each other in squalor that you can't imagine.
Yeah, have you seen, like, I always encourage people, like, go look at videos if you can of what it's like to just live in Egypt. Like, everyone kind of imagines what a favela looks like in South America, but really just look at the urban sprawl that these people live in. It's suffocating. You feel sick looking at it sometimes if you really try to imagine what it's like to be in there.
Right. And Cairo is the most dense city in the world, and it's been done so with like our tax dollars. The average Egyptian lives off $2 a day of Russian and Ukrainian wheat that are like baked into these little bread things that are like pita breads. That's what they live on. And it's US tax dollars that buy Russian and Ukrainian wheat. And there was nearly riots at the top of the government a couple of years ago when the war kicked off in Ukraine over the spike in food prices, because they just can't afford it. But, the Indians in Canada, right? We the Quebecois can make fun of, we are Quebecois, we are the true faith, you are a bunch of larpy Anglo-pagans with your pointy noses, right? They just see white guys. And the Canada, the Canadian Grammy Awards are called the Junos. And the reason they're called the Junos is that Canada had its own beach in the Second World War, Juno Beach. So this one little country had its entire theater. The Canadian Army in World War I was so fierce that they were the best imperial troops. These broad-shouldered Scottish, Irish white boys who'd been fed on beef and mutton, right? They were who farmed in Ontario and the prairies of Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta and logged the Pacific Northwest of British Columbia. They were bigger, they were better, they were stronger than the Brits at home, who hadn't really been fed a real diet in 1914 and 1915 and all the way into the 1940s. The average Indian man has the grip strength of a Polish woman. Like, so they go into Canada, right? And they see these tall, good-looking Anglo-Ukrainian, and yeah, there was some resentment about the Ukrainians, but like they're just going to Saskatchewan, right? Like right? They're going to Saskatchewan, they're going to Manitoba. Like let them have that part. They're going to go farm the wheat on this frozen hellscape. They should be used to that. But you look at these guys, and even though they're desperate to get over here and they lie about their credentials and they lie about what they're doing and they lie about all these other things, they resent the Canadian for just being better than they are, for being taller, for being better looking, for building a better place than they could build, for not living in filth. Like, yeah, you don't live in filth, lol. Like, no, I don't, because it's fucking disgusting to have.
You have to think about where they're coming from too, which is that they've probably been led to believe that Canada and America and Europe are so good just by luck of geography. They have that sort of guns, germs, and steel understanding of history. Is like they're only rich just because luck of the draw, and there's no difference between us, and we could just swap ourselves in there and just reap the rewards. And then they get here and realize they are completely ill-equipped for this lifestyle. They don't understand. They probably feel alien once they get here, as they should. But there's that great quote, civilization is incommunicable. There's a book I read recently that I'm sure many have read, which is The Camp of the Saints. I reviewed that with a friend of mine, T.R. Hudson, on his show Cannon Fodder. You can find, I think it's like an hour and a half where we actually go through the entire book. But that's what this is about, like the seething bitterness, the embracing of the identity of the other that they feel. Like they see themselves as outsiders. They see themselves, like I've gotten into debates with a couple Muslims before, because I pointed out to them, like, do you guys realize that you speak of yourselves as if you're a swarm of locusts? Like, you'll hear them talk and they'll say, guess what? We're going to outbreed you. And before long, you're going to be brown. Just like us. I said, you talk of yourself as if you're a plague. There's no dignity in how you describe yourselves. Do you notice that? And I actually don't think they do. But they, just like in Camp of the Saints, they see themselves as this sort of eternal, like entropic periphery just swarming in, and they don't have a plan B. They don't give a shit what happens. And they just feel like, I always have the line, you are not owed proximity to white people.
Well, this is a little bit more of my esoteric take, is that, without everything that's not with Christ is against Christ, or is it pagan, or it's opposite. But like, especially like these Muslims or the Indians, like, I'm sure there's demons all over these countries. The only thing that's going to drive them out is a good priest, and they don't have any access to that. But like, it's a sin, and it's it's a sin to live. Like, it's living in filth is a product of sin. The aggression, or like the lack of ability to control oneself is a product of sin. So a lot of it, their animalistic behavior. I think a lot of it just comes from demonic influences. Like you talked about recently, I forget the episode, but it was about the Aztecs and their they had feminism.
Yeah, that was the book was, I believe, Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin, and it was an interesting one. It was the Aztecs, and there was a couple other examples in there too. And the point of that whole part was to show that some people will say that female empowerment or feminism comes from the Enlightenment, or often they'll say it's like a Christian influence. And we're shown that no, it's this strange emergent phenomena that you get in these tribal cultures, oftentimes with a pretty rudimentary understanding of the world. So it's not even really linked to social advancement. I was just saying that the conflict between men and women is so much deeper than just the Enlightenment or any sort of ideology or religion or anything. It's something that I think all these things try and reconcile to various degrees.
Well, it's biological, right? We're just different, and men and women are strangers to each other. And like, I've been married 20 years, you know, like I, and still there are times when I'm like, what the hell was she thinking? And I'm sure she feels the same way, right? Like, that's just the way things are. And it's only within the sacrament of marriage and that you can even begin to kind of reconcile that you can, like, because men's interests and women's interests are inherently different, right? Like economics 101, right? Like sexual marketplace 101, like sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive. And, you know, the women's interest is like to have like 1 or 2 kids with like a really high value dude and then just coast off of that for the rest of your life and like do what you can to make sure your kids are successful. And then men, you know, like you want the entire scoop of Neapolitan ice cream, like you want the blonde brunette and the redhead, right? Like, and naturally, right, those conflict, and marriage, like, is the best, Christian marriage is the best reconciling of those two things. And these non-European, non-Christian people, right, like the Indians had Saint Thomas, the apostle, show up to their country and be like, let me tell you about this Jesus guy, and they rejected him. And they had St. Francis Xavier, the greatest missionary Jesuit, come back to them and try and tell them about, you know, and some of them, to their credit, you know, in Goa or some of the Thomas Christians, like, they accepted. But the vast majority of Indians were like, nah, man, we're cool with these demons. And that led to, you know, a certain outcome of a society. And it's a terrible society. It's filthy. It's disgusting. It's like viscerally just off-putting. There's all kinds of sexual abuse and rape and poverty, and I mean, like, they eat rats, man. Like, that's just
it's funny. I'm reminded of this.
Like, I mean, just the idea of it just gives you the willies. It's just sick. It's weird. It's gross. It's evil.
As I say, it reminds me of this book we read quite a while ago. It's titled "Heirs to Forgotten Kingdoms: Journeys into the Disappearing Religions, rather, of the Middle East," written by Gerard Russell. So it's this guy, typical, you know, liberal journalistic type, who's just going all throughout the Middle East, going through Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and looking at these these pre-Islamic, pre-Christian religions and seeing what has happened to them. He goes into, you know, Egypt as well. And the ones that haven't just been consumed by Islam, and there's maybe only 5,000, like the Zoroastrians would have been one, and the Mandaeans would be another. The Mithras is in there as well. And he goes in these communities, he talks to them, and they're all very nice, as they are to all outsiders, I'm sure. Once he describes what these religions believe, maybe I'm just too white of a guy. But when they say, you know, their god is a giant flaming peacock with fucking, you know, talons for teeth, I'm like, well, that just sounds like a demon. That sounds like Pazuzu. You know what I mean? That sounds like every one of their gods sounds like a horrible demon.
Literally, the psalm is saying, like, all the gods of the Gentiles are demons. Like, I mean, if that's what he's dealing with, I can kind of understand, you know, like, this is, and this notion that, like, you could take this person who thinks it's, my friends at the Old Glory Club have a wonderful live stream on Thursday nights, and my friend Pete Canone is a frequent co-host. But anytime they mention an Indian, they'll you know, play a train noise, because astonishing numbers of Indian men get hit by trains every year.
Dude, they just walk into trains.
Yeah.
Fuck.
And you know, I'm kind of the train autist, right? Like, the reason they do it is, A, they don't believe that, when you believe in reincarnation, the stakes for life are very low. Like, oh, well, you know, if I die now, I'll just come back, right? So moral behavior is not incentivized in the first place. Building for the future is not incentivized. But also, they have this insane culture where, like, it's considered cool and brave to just ignore obvious hazards.
I mean, they're the ones keeping live leak in business, like they're keeping those lights on, you know.
Well,
But that's a good point, though. The difference between linear time and cyclical time, and one of the great sources of that was Logos Rising from E. Michael Jones. But this is a very old idea. The idea of permanence, the idea like if you believe everything is cyclical, and you're in the Kali cycle and nothing really matters, you're powerless within the system. But within linear time, you are a fixed point, just like the death and resurrection of Christ. That was a one-time event. It doesn't happen every 10,000 years. So that he lived and he died and he lived again and he's the Son of God. Like that happened once. And so your Cartesian placement within that linear time, you're also a one-time thing. You're not going to come back. And that's important. And that actually governs how you interact with the world in so many different ways. And that the way you just described never even occurred to me. I'm like, well, that just must, for many of them, I would say most of them, they must just not see themselves as important or sovereign, you know, but also who gives a shit? I can just die because I'll come back. Like it's a video game.
like, yeah, just respawn.
But with us, like it's like it's a one-time thing. Make sure you fucking get it right. And that sort of spiritual or metaphysical permanence really separates the Western mind from the Eastern mind. I'm not speaking to the Chinese mind. I think that's obviously different than the Indian mind, but yeah, I don't even want to speak to that. We'll keep this within India.
Right. But how can you let millions of people with that kind of mindset just show up in your country and expect things to work out? Like how many thousands of people have been hurt on Canadian roads because people with that attitude are driving trucks that weigh 10,000 pounds?
And honestly, if we as a people are not ready to really admit that women aren't good at driving, we might not be ready to admit that Indians are bad at driving. Because something had shifted where within the mainstream liberal mind, many people are liberal. Even most conservatives are basically liberal. They loved other cultures, or they believed they loved other cultures, and then they encountered other cultures in a multicultural experiment. And now I don't even think they love these cultures, but they do hate what we are. So I saw a shift over the past 5 to 10 years where they don't love other cultures as much as they hate what they deem to be Nazis, what they deem to be the wrong type of white male, specifically that. So that really drives most of whatever this thing is they're doing right now. So I think you guys might be muted too.
Yeah, you're right. And they have been taught that, and you can see this, right? Like I've brought this up at the show in the past, but any kind of argument that is in the slightest way illiberal, well, that's just like Hitler. Like within 3 steps, right? You just see, well, that's Hitler. Hitler has replaced Satan in the liberal religion. The late great Bishop Williamson, who died recently, talked about this extensively, and that's why he was really thrown out of the Society of St. Pius X. That's what caused him to be ostracized by the rest of the church, is his accurate diagnosis of the modern religion, of the Holocaust and more racism, like and Nazis and Confederates are the same, and like anyone wearing gray and being organized is inherently evil, and the height of evilness, and slavery and Nazism are basically the same thing, and
we've adopted that too. And like we were talking about with the aftermath of how people were talking about the Unite the Right thing, which is like anyone who's organizing anything, we will look like that, so we can never organize. Anyone who tells you to organize, be suspicious of them, get rid of them. So we adopted a lot of this frame as well, unfortunately. Also, interestingly enough, and maybe I promise, I really wanted to talk more about the Catholicism as well. We actually didn't get to the main thing we were going to talk about, but I'm having such a good time talking about this. I am noticing, as many others have, some what you might call Hitler fatigue. And
yes.
One thing I noticed just recently, it was we started talking. It was about the news that I'm not happy with, which is that Trump is talking about deporting all the Palestinians and resettling them somewhere. Of course, we're not thrilled with that. But people are talking about, oh, you know who also tried to deport and resettle? Hitler to the Jews. And I said, okay, well, hold on. So we're having a mainstream conversation about how Hitler really wanted to resettle the Jews before the Holocaust.
Right.
Let's go with that.
Yeah. Madagascar would be way nicer. I mean, lemurs and Jews, what else could go wrong?
Yeah, because
right?
you're not allowed to say that at all. Like 10
Yeah.
years ago, but now like everyone's saying that. Okay.
Well, and like I think we were talking about this before the call, but like certainly, you know, this Jordan Peterson art conference is just stuff I was saying 10 years ago, or maybe 15. You know, like this is not new stuff. The mainstream is stealing our talking points. They're taking notes. You know, the CSIS people who are listening to this program, the FBI people who are listening to this program, you can't really refute our arguments. You're just like, oh, but Hitler. Like, well, okay, yeah, whatever. I'm going to step over that. I don't care about your obsession with Austrian Painter Man. Like, it doesn't matter.
To real people, it doesn't matter. To Gen Z, it doesn't matter at all.
No, and I'm old as fuck. And you know, like I want a functioning society for my children, and if that means I have to be like, okay, well, Franco wasn't that bad a guy, and Mussolini wasn't that bad a guy. You know, like my kids need to be able to buy a house and get married. I guess we're gonna have to reject some liberalism. Feminism is bad because it means, you know, my daughters. Oh no feminism, so my daughters won't be prostitutes. My sons will actually have women worth marrying. Yeah, like you're supposed to sell me on this, like, oh well, you know, with feminism, like houses can be too expensive for any of your children to buy, and your daughters can be whores. Like what?
And that's the most important thing to have, what you just described, which is a acute vision of what you want and having first principles about what things matter to you. You know, I'll give you an example of what's happening in Canada. So some people might say there's a housing crisis up here. We just bought our first home, which is a miracle, but housing prices in Canada are preposterous. But that's a big topic of conversation. We don't have real economic conversations. We just have conversations about eggs and houses. Okay, fine. Now, you will hear people say, well, we need more houses. The problem is that there's a housing shortage, so we need more houses. And anyone who's been paying attention knows where that leads. It's going to be smaller houses, cheaper houses on smaller plots of land. Basically, you're going to get townhouses with a sliver of space between them, so they count as detached, even though they're not. You see these new developments now. If you go looking, you'll see these. You see them in the UK too, but these like strange subdivisions with oddly shaped and narrow houses and a little patch of grass. So when I say I want housing, I'm specific. I want a big house on a big property. I want a big fucking backyard and a front yard and a driveway. Now I'm Canadian. You're not going to sell me on the 15-minute city. It takes 3 hours to get anywhere, and everyone has a truck. That's just how it's got to be. Because
Canada's the second largest country by area in the world. Like what you're going to run out of room? Have you seen, you know, like
yeah, and so I'm like, when I say house, I want a house that I can actually have a good garden on, and I can have a dog or two and a big family. And I don't care how fucking unreasonable that sounds. And everyone sees, oh, well, I can't have that because that's not, I don't know, green. That's not renewable. It doesn't fucking matter. I want it. I deserve it. I'm sorry they can't have that in Cairo. I'm sorry they can't have that in Japan. They're used to it. I'm not. Fuck you. That's what I want. And I'm explicit.
Like as a Canadian, you have a right to have a yard that you can set up like a half-size rink in the backyard and, you know, have the backyard rink. And if the yard isn't big enough that where your kids can get to be good skaters on the meticulously maintained backyard rink that you build every winter with the tarp and the water and the hose and, you know, hot mopping it every day
and you don't need to justify. Same thing with Americans too. It's like, do you really need to have these guns? Yeah, everyone should have 40 guns. Fuck you. That's why.
Right. Well, and Canadians too. This is I've talked about this, but like if we're going to be in NATO, I think every member of NATO deserves the First and Second Amendment. That's my. You want me to stay? You want America to stay in NATO? Everyone gets the First and Second Amendment.
Exactly. And people will come back at you. Well, is that reasonable? Oh no, you mistake me. I'm no longer trying to be reasonable. I'm telling
I don't
you
give a
what I want.
like I you tried to tell me that it was reasonable to be okay with locking me in my house for 3 years and chopping the testicles off little boys.
Yes.
We're not doing reasonable. You and I can have a conversation about reasonable. But if you think that like I owe you reasonable after the last 5 years, you're high. And I'm like, we're having a religious conflict. I'm not pretending that we don't like I am in my own way. Admittedly, it's online, but I'm fighting a crusade against Satanist pedophiles who rape kids and worship devils. And you can't, when you say, well, yeah, we're going to build this statue to this Hindu demon in the middle of town and you can't object to it. Like, well, you're worshiping a devil in a Canadian city. I don't like that. And, and yeah, we think we should chop the testicles off a 12-year-old boy and slice off the breasts of a 13-year-old girl. Like, okay, so you're sacrificing children to Moloch and worshiping demons.
Yeah, and
we're not having a conversation anymore. This is not,
yeah.
The Quebecois Little Sisters of the Poor and the Anglicans having a civil discussion about how best to teach the Indians Christianity and how to wash themselves.
Yeah, and we're not falling for it anymore. We're not falling for the rhetorical tricks of, oh, I can build a Satan statue because you had a statue of your guy, of Jesus, whoever it might be, and maybe that makes me feel like, no, shut up. I'm going to slap you in the face with a white leather glove until you turn into fucking stardust. That's what's going to happen. I'm not engaging in this dialectic anymore. That all that does is get you caught up in the, well, that's what every libertarian fell for. There's those who divorce themselves from that over the pedophilia issue. Like, well, I guess we need to allow child pornography if we're being internally consistent. No. I don't care about that anymore. I care about what I want. And I'm crazy. I'm stupid and I'm crazy. Sure, let's start with that. I don't fucking care. And you know what? No one else does either. I just saw for the past month, it's everyone laughing their asses off at bureaucrats getting fired. And they'll say, well, I'm crying. My kids can't eat. Good. Ha, 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 ha. Everyone's lost their minds.
Eggs are 50 cents an egg. American dollars.
Exactly. We're done being reasonable. We're all crazy. We want what we want.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to fall for your stuff anymore.
Right. Well, and I think that this is why the more unreasonable we are, the more we're going to get, because for years and years and years, people, you dealt with these crazy people, and it's like, well, they're insane. Why are we even, countenancing this? And well, because is it really that big a deal? Just, maybe they'll stop whining. Well, it turns out they never stopped whining. They started worshiping Satan and messing with kids. So when, and if you do the philosophical groundwork, you see that was always the goal, and it's always Satanism. And here's why, right? That no one, maybe some stoned guys who smoke too much weed, think going to India is going to be like this experience where, maybe like a bunch of idiotic Beatle type guys in the 70s thought going to India was going to like lead to enlightenment or something. But you're here. You're in my home, squatting on my couch, eating food out of my fridge, and complaining that I don't have curry in my fridge. Well, we don't do curry here, bro. We do roast beef here.
We do meat pies, which I just got into recently, by the way.
Oh,
big into meat pies. But I know I'm looking at Patrick right now, and I'm hearing his voice in my head, or the voice of the Christian world saying, Dimes, can you reconcile everything you just said with the Catholic Church? I believe that you can. And I know you might have mentioned this before, but on that show with Prudentialist, Do You Even Read? We had covered the book On Resistance to Violence by Force by Ivan Ilyin, who's an Eastern Orthodox man. Very, very famous figure, radical figure. But he was making the case, and he was arguing against Tolstoy. He was making the case against pacifism by saying that you have a duty to fight against evil, and you have a duty to resist evil aggressively and by force if necessary. Not condoning torture, not condoning anything too extreme, but you have a duty to not be pacifist and to let evil wash over you, which was what Tolstoy was saying, that you cannot even resist evil because all violence in itself is evil. And where Ivan Ilyin, I believe many others said, no, you can wield violence in the name of good. And so, well, Dimes, how can you reconcile these wild things you said with Christianity, with Catholicism? Aren't you supposed to love your fellow man? Yes. Aren't you supposed to be charitable? Yes. However, there is a political angle. The system that we're describing as Dark Enlightenment had so been so kind as to describe was, you're dealing with a satanic system. You're dealing with a system that will, and if left to its own devices, if granted all the power, will create a nihilistic satanic cesspit. And so you are fighting to take it on another path, to avert that course. My path does not lead to a nihilistic satanic cesspit. And so if I am inelegant in how I address this, if I am a bit radical in what I think needs to happen to avert that course, it is in the interest of a brighter future and a better tomorrow. And so, and I don't think we have the privilege to be, to be pacifist at all with this, or to be too tolerant.
Yeah, like in 1957 in America, you could say, you could kind of let it slide because things look good. In Canada in 1983, you could look around and go, basically everyone's Canadian. They might not go to church as much as they often do, and they maybe drink too much, but they're Canadian. And now we've seen what that indulgence and that sort of attitude has led us to. And, we're in an existential fight for the Western world, for the white race, for Christianity. And we're not in it. We're not privileged enough to let things slide. And, and I think that's the, we didn't get to, we'd love to have you back. It's been,
I 100% want to come back because we didn't get to talk about the main thing we were going to, which is kind of, we're getting into it just now, but I have to get going soon, which was, and we'll tease this for the next episode, the international child sex trafficking syndicates that are woven into not only private, but also public institutions,
including the Vatican. Dear listener, Theodore McCarrick, known pedophile, was the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. at the same time as Dennis Hastert, the former Republican Speaker of the House, who is also a pedophile. And from 2001 to 2006, they were both in the same town at the same time in vast positions of influence and power. And if you think those two didn't know each other, I have a bridge to sell you. And Dimes will have you back to discuss this stuff.
And just to recontextualize it, just what we said before we go, they are trying to marginalize you, me, listener, everyone for knowing about that. If you bring that up, this is the system that says you're kooky. Don't even look into that. Don't connect these dots. You're crazy for even thinking it's important. So that's how you know the problem is massive. That's how you know the system itself. And this is the angle that you take. I think that the entire system is that corrupt as to permit this. Sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you for being here. Can you give everyone your links and where to find you and listen to your excellent program?
Oh, yes. Bloodsatellite.ca is where you can find full episodes of the show and all the clips and everything. I publish articles on the Vanguardist Journal, and that's vanguardistjournal.substack.com. You can find that. I mentioned one short film that I produced in the past few months with a team of guys from our space called Paving Over the Public. So look that up, Paving Over the Public on YouTube. And it's in what I just described before about Canadian history of migration and multiculturalism. it's a lot of what we've been talking about. So yeah, let's just leave it at those three.
And I have to recommend all three in the strongest possible terms. I get all my Canadian news from Dimes, and I just want to say thank you very much for being here. Please, listeners, check Dimes out, support him if you can, and please keep an eye out or an ear out for the next time when we discuss this satanic system in a little bit more depth. Thank you very much for being here, Dimes.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. This was very, very fun.